I rolled over and checked my phone for the third time in 10 minutes, knowing I wouldn't fall asleep anytime soon. Military exercises had drained every muscle in my body, but my mind kept cycling through equipment checks and tomorrow's training schedule. The apartment felt too quiet, too still after spending the day surrounded by constant noise and movement. When my phone buzzed against the nightstand, Andrew's name lit up the screen. 11 p.m. was late for him to call, especially these days when he barely worked during normal hours. I answered on the second ring. "James, I found something." His voice cracked through the speaker, raw and desperate in a way that made me sit up immediately. "Something that can bring her back. Emily. Always Emily." 3 months since she disappeared from the playground 6 blocks from Andrew's house, and he still talked about her like she might walk through the door any second. The police had followed every lead, interviewed every neighbor, checked every database. Nothing. She'd simply disappeared between the monkey bars and the swing set, while Andrew bought coffee from a food truck 30 yards away. "Andrew, man, it's late. Are you..." I know how this sounds. His words came fast, urgent, like he was afraid I'd hang up. "But this is real, James. This is actually real." I pressed my fingers against my temples. We'd been down this road before. Countless weekends spent exploring abandoned hospitals and supposedly haunted cemeteries, chasing stories about ghostly children who might lead us to Emily. Andrew had always been drawn to supernatural explanations for the unexplainable, but losing Emily had turned that interest into an obsession. Every psychic, every medium, every person claiming to communicate with missing children, Andrew had contacted them all. None of it ever led anywhere real. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "Home. James, please, I need you to see this." The panic in his voice cut through my exhaustion. Andrew had been drowning for months, barely eating, sleeping maybe 3 hours a night when the nightmares led him. His sister called me twice a week, worried he might hurt himself. I'd never heard him sound focused like this, not since Emily disappeared. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and reached for my jeans. "I'll be there in an hour." "Thank you. Thank you, James. Just come alone, okay? And don't call anyone else." The line went dead before I could respond. I dressed quickly, grabbing my keys and wallet from the kitchen counter. The drive from my base apartment to downtown Sacramento usually took 40 minutes, but the late hour meant empty highways and green lights. Andrew lived in one of those older neighborhoods where the houses sat close together, each one painted a different shade of blue or yellow or cream. His place was a small 2-story with a front porch that Emily used to decorate with chalk drawings. The house looked normal from the street. Porch light on, car in the driveway. No obvious signs of crisis. But when I knocked on the front door, it opened immediately, like Andrew had been standing right behind it. He looked awful. Worse than awful. His hair stuck up in different directions, his clothes were wrinkled like he'd slept in them for days, and his eyes were so bloodshot I wondered when he'd last blinked. But there was something else. Something I hadn't seen since before Emily disappeared. An intensity, an energy that made him seem more present than he'd been in months. "Come in, quick!" He grabbed my arm and pulled me inside, immediately turning the deadbolt behind us. The living room was messier than usual, which was saying something. Papers covered the coffee table in overlapping layers, some printed from websites, others covered in Andrew's handwriting. The curtains were drawn tight, and empty coffee mugs sat on every surface. It smelled like someone had been living on takeout and forgetting to shower. "Andrew, what's going on?" I asked, but he was already moving toward the kitchen. "I met someone today, outside the grocery store." His hands shook as he gestured for me to follow. He knew about Emily, knew things nobody else could know. We'd explored dozens of supposedly haunted locations together over the years. Old cemeteries where people claimed to see children playing among the headstones. Abandoned buildings where witnesses reported hearing voices calling for help. A farmhouse outside Stockton where 3 kids had disappeared in the 1970s. Andrew always hoped we'd find something real, some proof that death wasn't final, that missing people might still exist somewhere beyond normal reach. I'd gone along with it because he needed the hope, but nothing we ever encountered felt genuinely supernatural. Just whined through broken windows and shadows that moved in predictable ways. This felt different. Andrew moved with purpose instead of desperation, like he'd found an actual answer instead of another dead end. He led me to the kitchen table, where a black leather notebook sat by itself. The cover looked expensive, unmarked except for small scratches along the edges that could have been from normal wear. It seemed ordinary enough, just sitting there under the overhead light. "He gave me this," Andrew said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said it would explain everything." I stared at the notebook, trying to figure out what about it had convinced Andrew this was worth a midnight phone call. It looked like something someone might use for journaling or taking notes. Nothing mystical or obviously supernatural about it. "Who gave it to you?" I asked. Andrew's hands kept shaking as he reached toward the notebook, then stopped just before touching it. "A man in a gray suit. Said he'd been looking for me specifically, that he knew what happened to Emily." My stomach got tight. Grieving parents were magnets for scam artists and people who got off on others' pain. "Andrew, think about this. Someone approaches you randomly, claims to know about Emily, gives you a notebook that supposedly explains everything. This sounds like someone taking advantage of..." He knew her middle name. Andrew's voice cut through my objection. He knew she had a birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. He knew she always insisted on wearing mismatched socks. Those details stopped me cold. Andrew was right. Only family would know those things. Maybe a close family friend, but Andrew kept his circle small. Emily's quirks weren't the kind of information that would show up in police reports or newspaper articles. "What did he want in return?" I asked, because there was always a catch with these things. "Nothing. Yet." Andrew finally picked up the notebook, holding it like it might break apart in his hands. He said I'd understand everything once I read this, and then I could decide what to do next. The whole situation felt wrong in ways I couldn't figure out how to say. Men in gray suits didn't hand out mysterious notebooks to grieving fathers outside grocery stores. But the intensity in Andrew's eyes, the first real focus he'd shown in months, made me hesitate to shut this down immediately. "Have you read it yet?" I asked. He shook his head. "I was waiting for you. I needed someone else here when I opened it." Andrew put the notebook back on the table and looked at me with an expression I knew from our weekend explorations. Equal parts hope and terror, like he was afraid of being disappointed again, but couldn't stop himself from believing this time might be different. I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down across from him. Whatever was in that notebook, whatever elaborate scam or cruel joke someone was playing on Andrew, I wasn't going to let him face it alone. "Okay," I said. "Let's see what this is about." Andrew reached for the notebook again, this time lifting it with both hands like he was handling something sacred. I watched his fingers trace the leather cover, following those subtle scratches along the edges that caught the kitchen light. When he passed it across the table to me, I expected it to feel normal, maybe a little worn from handling. Instead, the leather was unusually cold against my palms, smooth in a way that seemed almost unnatural, like it had been polished to an impossible finish. "Feel that?" Andrew asked, his eyes fixed on my face. I did feel it. The temperature difference was noticeable enough that I almost pulled my hands back. But cold leather wasn't supernatural. Maybe the notebook had been sitting in Andrew's car or near an air conditioning vent. I pushed down the urge to find rational explanations and opened the cover. The pages inside were filled with handwritten text in dark ink, each line perfectly straight across the paper. No ruled lines underneath, no grid to guide the writing, but every sentence sat level and precise like it had been typed by a machine. The handwriting itself looked deliberately careful, each letter formed with identical spacing and pressure. Whoever had written this had taken their time. I looked at the first page, then flipped through several more. The text described specific steps for contacting someone called Mr. Gosmix, who could supposedly grant any wish in exchange for something of equal value. Not money or favors, but actual equivalents. A life for a life, a memory for a memory, pain for pain. The instructions read like a recipe, complete with detailed preparation requirements and warnings about what could go wrong if the steps were performed incorrectly. I kept reading while Andrew talked, noting how the handwriting never changed or changed pace. The person who wrote this had either practiced extensively or possessed an unnaturally steady hand. Each instruction was numbered and detailed, covering everything from room preparation to specific words that needed to be spoken. What did he want? I asked. To help. He said Emily was trapped somewhere between life and death, and only Mr. Gosmix could bring her back. Andrew pointed to a section in the notebook I hadn't reached yet. He said conventional searches would never find her because she's not exactly alive, but she's not exactly dead either. I flipped to the page Andrew pointed to and found a detailed explanation of what the writer called liminal existence, a state where souls became lost between worlds after violent or traumatic deaths. The text claimed that children were particularly vulnerable to this fate, their spirits too confused or frightened to move on properly. According to the notebook, Mr. Gosmix specialized in retrieving these lost souls and returning them to life. Andrew, this is obviously a scam targeting grieving parents, I said, though even as I spoke, the words felt insufficient. Someone saw your story in the news, researched the details, and crafted this whole elaborate con to take advantage of your pain. But Andrew shook his head before I finished talking. I thought the same thing at first, but look at page 15. I turned to the page and found preparation instructions that were way more complex than any simple con would need. The procedure required covering all mirrors in the house except one, turning off all electronic devices to prevent interference, and creating a protective circle using white chalk and 4 black candles positioned at cardinal points. The level of detail showed someone had put serious thought and research into creating this ritual, way beyond what would be necessary to fool a desperate parent. He gave me addresses for 3 different occult supply shops where I could find everything I needed, Andrew said. Real places, James. I drove to 2 of them today and bought white chalk, black candles, and thick blankets to cover the mirrors. I looked around the kitchen, noticing for the first time that Andrew's microwave display was dark, and the digital clock on his coffee maker wasn't glowing. He'd already started following the instructions. You turned off your electronics, I said. Just unplug them. The notebook says any electrical interference can disrupt the connection to Mr. Gosmix. Andrew's voice carried a certainty I hadn't heard since before Emily disappeared. I spent the whole afternoon gathering supplies and preparing. Everything's ready. I studied Andrew's face, looking for signs of the crushing grief that had eaten at him for months. The red-rimmed eyes and hollow cheeks were still there, but something had changed. He sat straighter, spoke with purpose, moved with direction instead of wandering around lost. Having a real plan, even an impossible one, had given him focus again. Andrew, listen to yourself, I said. You're talking about performing some kind of occult ritual based on instructions from a complete stranger, even if this Mr. Gosmix existed, which he doesn't. What makes you think the cost would be worth it? Andrew turned to another page in the notebook, one that described the exchange system in detail. According to the text, Mr. Gosmix wanted equal value for his services, not money or possessions, but something equal in worth to what was being asked for. For a child's life, the cost would be huge. I don't care what it costs, Andrew said quietly. Emily is 8 years old. She should have 70 more years ahead of her, maybe 80. Whatever Mr. Gosmix wants in exchange, it's worth it. The determination in his voice was complete, the kind of certainty that came from months of hopelessness, finally finding an outlet. I realized that no amount of logical argument would convince him this was a bad idea. Andrew had made his decision before I'd even arrived. When were you planning to attempt this? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Tonight. The instructions say the ritual works best between midnight and dawn, when the boundary between worlds is thinnest. Andrew glanced at the kitchen clock, which showed 11:43. We have about 15 minutes to finish the preparation. I closed the notebook and pushed it back across the table. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The convenient timing, the elaborate preparation requirements, the promises of impossible results. But Andrew's renewed sense of purpose worried me more than his earlier despair. Desperate hope could drive people to dangerous places. Andrew, please think about this rationally, I said. Grieving parents are targets for all kinds of cruel people. Someone researched your case, learned those private details, and created this whole elaborate story to manipulate you. The dangers of following these instructions could be real, even if the supernatural elements aren't. But Andrew was already standing, moving with more energy than I'd seen from him in months. He picked up the notebook and headed toward the living room, where I could see blankets draped over what must have been the television and computer monitors. I've been rational for 3 months, James, he called back to me. Rational got me nowhere. The police were rational. The search teams were rational. The psychologists were rational. None of them brought Emily back. I followed him into the living room, where I could see how much he'd prepared. Every mirror I could see had been covered with thick blankets, held down with tape or thumbtacks. The room felt smaller with all the covered surfaces, like being inside a cave or tomb. Andrew had moved furniture to create open floor space, and I could see white chalk marks where he'd started drawing something on the hardwood. The only mirror I left uncovered is the big one in the hallway, Andrew explained, consulting the notebook as he spoke. The instructions say Mr. Gosmix needs a clear reflection to manifest through, but all other mirrors have to be blocked to prevent interference. He knelt down and began extending the chalk marks into a perfect circle, large enough for 2 people to stand inside. His movements were careful and exact, following measurements he'd clearly figured out earlier. This wasn't last-minute panic. Andrew had spent hours planning and preparing every detail. I watched him work, recognizing the focused intensity that used to mark our weekend explorations. Back then, his interest in supernatural stuff had been academic curiosity mixed with hope. Now it was pure necessity, the last option available to a father who'd tried every normal possibility. What if you're wrong about this? I asked. What if the stranger was lying, or delusional, or just cruel? What if you perform this ritual and nothing happens except wasted time and false hope? Andrew paused in his chalk drawing and looked up at me. Then I'll be exactly where I am now, except I'll know I tried everything possible. But what if I'm right, James? What if Emily really is trapped somewhere, waiting for me to find her? What if this actually works? The circle was nearly complete, and Andrew moved to position 4 black candles at what appeared to be cardinal points around the edge. Each candle was identical, thick, unscented, and pure black from base to wick. He lit them with wooden matches rather than a lighter, following the notebook's specific instructions about avoiding modern ignition sources. The candlelight made dancing shadows across the walls, making the draped mirrors look like covered corpses waiting in the corners. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, though that could have been psychological reaction to the eerie atmosphere Andrew had created. "The ritual has to start exactly at midnight," Andrew said, checking his watch. "We have 3 minutes." I realized he expected me to join him inside the chalk circle, to participate in whatever he was planning to attempt. The thought of encouraging this delusion, of helping Andrew potentially harm himself with false hope, made my stomach turn. But leaving him alone felt even worse. "Andrew, there are real dangers here that have nothing to do with supernatural forces," I said. "What if this is all set up for something criminal? What if the stranger who gave you that notebook is planning to break in while you're distracted by this ritual? What if he's watching the house right now, waiting for you to turn off all your electronics and light candles that announce you're following his instructions?" But Andrew was already stepping inside the chalk circle, the notebook open in his hands. The candle flames blinked slightly, though I couldn't feel any drafts in the sealed room. He turned to face the uncovered mirror down the hallway, visible through the living room doorway. "James, I need you to understand something," he said, his voice steady and determined. "Emily is my daughter. She's everything good in my life, everything worth fighting for. If there's even a 1% chance this could bring her back, I have to try. I can't live with myself knowing I had an opportunity and walked away from it." The candlelight played across his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and the sharp angles of cheekbones that had become too prominent from months of barely eating. But his expression held more strength and purpose than I'd seen since Emily's disappearance. "I know how this looks," Andrew continued. "I know it sounds crazy, but crazy is all I have left. Everything rational and sensible and logical has failed. So now, I'm going to try something that shouldn't be possible, because impossible is better than giving up." He checked his watch one more time, then looked down at the open notebook. The pages seemed to catch the candlelight differently than normal paper should, reflecting the flames in a way that made the text appear to move slightly. "It's time," Andrew said. Andrew closed the notebook and walked toward the hallway mirror. I followed, watching him position himself so he could see his reflection clearly from the living room doorway. He studied the angle for a moment, then nodded to himself, like he'd solved some important problem. "Help me with this," he said, heading toward the bathroom. Inside the small space, Andrew pulled a thick gray blanket from the linen closet and shook it out. The bathroom mirror was mounted directly above the sink, making it awkward to reach. He climbed onto the toilet seat, balancing carefully while trying to put the blanket over the mirror's surface. "Andrew, this is insane," I said. But when he started wobbling on the narrow seat, I grabbed the bottom edge of the blanket anyway. "You're going to break your neck." "Just hold it steady while I tape the corners," he muttered, pulling a roll of masking tape from his pocket. I kept the blanket tight while he secured each corner, the fabric hanging heavy and dark over what had been a simple bathroom mirror. The space felt smaller with the reflective surface gone, like we were standing inside a cave instead of his bathroom. Andrew climbed down and stepped back to check his work, making sure no gaps remained where the mirror might show through. We moved through the house step by step after that. Andrew had blankets stacked on the couch, each one chosen specifically for size and thickness. The television was easy enough to cover, but the computer monitor in his home office required careful positioning to avoid knocking over his desk lamp. Every covered surface made the house feel more closed off, more cut off from the outside world. The stranger knew about Emily's birthmark, Andrew said as we worked. The crescent moon on her left shoulder. That's not something he could have found in police reports or newspaper articles. I helped him drape a blanket over the bathroom medicine cabinet mirror, the small reflective surface disappearing under dark fabric. People research missing children cases obsessively sometimes. Online forums, social media posts. Maybe someone who knew your family shared details they shouldn't have. But even as I said it, the explanation felt weak. Andrew was right about the specifics. Emily's birthmark wasn't something that would come up in casual conversation, and Andrew had always been protective of personal details about his daughter. He knew she always insisted on wearing mismatched socks, Andrew continued, moving toward the bedroom. Red sock on the left foot, blue on the right. Every single day since she learned to dress herself. That's not the kind of detail that shows up in missing persons reports. The bedroom mirror was the largest one so far, a full-length glass mounted on the closet door. Andrew spread a king-sized comforter across its surface, smoothing out the wrinkles until the reflection disappeared completely. With each covered mirror, the house felt more cut off from reality, as if we were sealing ourselves inside some kind of ritual chamber. We should call the police about this stranger, I said. Describe him to them. Let them investigate how he got those details. That's what normal people do when someone approaches them with suspicious information about their missing child. Andrew stopped smoothing the comforter and turned to face me, his hands in fists at his sides. Normal people, James? Normal people don't have their 8-year-old daughters disappear without a trace. Normal people don't spend 3 months watching police investigations go nowhere. Normal people don't get approached by strangers who know impossible details about their family. The anger in his voice was sharper than anything I'd heard from him since Emily's disappearance. For months he'd been hollow, defeated, barely functional. Now he moved with angry purpose, like someone who'd found an outlet for feelings that had been eating him alive. Conventional help failed, Andrew said, pulling the television cord from the wall socket. The police failed. The search teams failed. The psychologists failed. The FBI failed. Everyone with training and experience and rational explanations failed to bring Emily back. He moved to the computer and unplugged it as well, the monitor going dark. The microwave had already been disconnected, its digital display blank. Andrew worked his way through the living room, unplugging lamps and the cable box and anything else with an electrical cord. Electronic interference disrupts the connection, he explained, consulting the notebook again. Any device that generates electromagnetic fields can interfere with Mr. Gosmix's ability to manifest. I watched him disconnect the stereo system and unplug his cell phone charger from the wall. The rational part of my mind knew this was elaborate theater, a grief-stricken father following instructions designed to make him feel like he was taking meaningful action. But Andrew's complete commitment to every detail made it hard to dismiss entirely. This is Emily's only chance, Andrew said, returning to the living room with the notebook open in his hands. Whatever Mr. Gosmix wants in exchange, it's worth it. Emily deserves to live her life. She deserves to grow up and go to school and have friends and fall in love and have children of her own. She deserves 70 more years, not just 8. He knelt on the hardwood floor and began drawing with white chalk, creating a circle large enough for 2 people to stand inside comfortably. His movements were precise and measured, like he'd practiced this beforehand. The chalk line formed a perfect curve, meeting exactly where it had started to create an unbroken boundary. "Stand back," Andrew said, consulting the notebook for the next step. He pulled 4 black candles from a paper bag and positioned them around the circle's edge, placing each one at what appeared to be cardinal directions. The candles were identical, thick, unscented, pure black from base to wick. Andrew lit them with wooden matches rather than a lighter, following the notebook's specific instructions about avoiding modern ignition sources. The candlelight immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Shadows moved across the walls in patterns that looked almost alive, changing and moving in ways that made my eyes want to follow their movement. The covered mirrors became tall shapes in the corners, draped like furniture in an abandoned house or bodies waiting for burial. Andrew double-checked each candle's position against the notebook's instructions, adjusting their placement by inches until he was satisfied with the arrangement. The flames burned steadily, giving off warm light that should have been comforting, but somehow felt threatening instead. "The circle has to be perfect," Andrew said, running his finger along the chalk line to check for breaks or gaps. Any imperfection in the boundary could allow unwanted entities to interfere with the summoning. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as he completed the preparations, though that could have been the late hour catching up with us. My watch showed 11:57. Outside, the neighborhood was completely quiet. No traffic or voices or signs of life. Just Andrew and me in a house full of covered mirrors and burning candles, preparing to attempt something that shouldn't be possible. Andrew stood up and brushed chalk dust from his knees, then looked around the living room one final time. Every mirror was covered. Every electronic device was unplugged. 4 black candles burned at the cardinal points of a perfect chalk circle. The notebook lay open to the page containing Mr. Gosmix's summoning instructions. "Everything's ready," Andrew said, his voice carrying a mixture of determination and barely controlled fear. I realized this was my last chance to talk him out of whatever he was planning to try. In 3 minutes, he would step inside that chalk circle and begin reading from the notebook, calling out to something that either didn't exist or shouldn't be contacted. Either way, nothing good would come from it. But looking at Andrew's face in the candlelight, seeing the first real purpose he'd shown since Emily's disappearance, I knew no amount of rational argument would change his mind. He'd already decided this was his daughter's only chance, and he was going to take it regardless of the consequences. The house felt colder now, sealed off from the outside world by covered mirrors and turned-off electronics. We stood in the blinking candlelight, surrounded by draped shapes that looked like waiting mourners, while Andrew prepared to call out to something that promised impossible things in exchange for unknown costs. Andrew checked his watch one more time, then stepped into the chalk circle. The white lines seemed to shine faintly in the candlelight, though that was probably just an optical illusion created by the contrast against the dark hardwood floor. He turned toward me and held out his hand, palm up, like he was inviting me to join him on a dance floor. "James, I need you in here with me," he said, his voice steady but urgent. I looked at his outstretched hand, then at the chalk circle, then at the notebook open to pages covered in neat handwriting. Everything about this felt wrong, but not in the way I'd expected. The wrongness wasn't coming from Andrew's desperation or the detailed ritual preparations. It was something else. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up, even though the room had gotten warmer since we'd lit the candles. "I can't do that," I said, taking a half step backward instead of forward. "I'm staying right here." Andrew's face fell slightly, but he nodded like he'd been expecting my refusal. "Okay, but don't leave. Whatever happens, please don't leave." The pleas in his voice carried 3 months of built-up grief and loneliness. I couldn't participate in this delusion, but I wasn't going anywhere either. Andrew had been falling apart since Emily's disappearance, and this ritual represented the first time he'd shown real hope about anything. False hope, probably, but still better than the empty depression that had been eating away at him. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. Andrew turned away from me and faced the hallway, where the uncovered mirror showed the living room's candlelit interior. His reflection looked strange from my angle, twisted by the mirror's position and the moving shadows from the candle flames. He held the notebook open in both hands, reading silently for a moment before looking up at his reflection. "Mr. Gosmix," Andrew said clearly, his voice carrying more confidence than I'd heard from him in months. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" The words hung in the air between us. Andrew waited, watching his reflection carefully, like he expected something to respond immediately. When nothing happened, he looked down at the notebook again and repeated the same phrase, louder this time. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" I watched the candle flames as he spoke, noting how they flashed slightly with each repetition. That made sense. Andrew's voice was creating air currents that would naturally disturb the flames, but the movement seemed more pronounced than it should have been, especially since we were in a closed room with no open windows or doors. Andrew continued the incantation, his voice growing stronger and more commanding with each repetition. He stood straighter inside the chalk circle, shoulders squared, projecting the kind of authority I remembered from our weekend exploration trips when he'd been convinced we were about to discover something extraordinary. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" The candle flames moved more wildly now, bending and swaying in patterns that didn't match any air movement I could feel. I held my hand out, checking for drafts that might explain the disturbance, but the air around me felt completely still. The flames continued their weird movement, sometimes leaning toward the chalk circle, sometimes away from it. Andrew had been repeating the incantation for several minutes when I first noticed the temperature change. The room had been comfortably warm from the candles and our body heat, but now I could feel cold air moving across my skin. Not a draft exactly, more like the temperature was dropping evenly throughout the space. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmiz, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" My breath started forming small white clouds as Andrew spoke. The cold wasn't gradual anymore. It was dropping fast enough that I could watch the condensation appear and disappear with each exhale. I looked at Andrew, who seemed completely focused on his reflection in the hallway mirror, sweat beginning to form on his forehead, even as the room grew frigid around us. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, too quiet to make out words, but loud enough to be clearly audible. I turned around, looking around the covered mirrors and draped furniture, but saw nothing that could have produced the sound. The whisper came again, this time from a different direction, like someone was moving around the room just outside my vision. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" Andrew's voice had taken on an urgent quality, like he was trying to reach someone who wasn't quite listening. The sweat on his face was more visible now, dark patches forming on his shirt even though the temperature kept dropping. He kept his eyes locked on the mirror, completely focused on whatever he expected to see there. The whispers multiplied. Instead of single voices coming from different locations, I started hearing overlapping sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They were still too quiet to understand, but they created a constant background murmur that made my skin crawl. The voices didn't sound human exactly. They carried a quality that reminded me of wind through broken windows or water running through old pipes. "Andrew," I said, but he either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me entirely. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" The whispers got louder, changing from background noise to something more active. I could hear individual voices now, though they spoke in languages I didn't recognize or used words that seemed to change meaning as I tried to understand them. The sounds came from every direction at once, creating a chorus that filled the room without seeming to come from any specific source. Andrew showed no reaction to the whispers, continuing his chanting with increasing intensity. His voice had become hoarse from repetition, but he kept going without pause, sweat now streaming down his face even though the cold had me shivering in my jacket. The situation had gone far beyond anything I could explain away. Cold rooms and blinking candles could be explained, but not voices with no bodies speaking in impossible languages. I reached toward Andrew's shoulder, planning to physically pull him out of the chalk circle and end whatever was happening. "Andrew, we need to stop this," I said, grabbing his shoulder firmly. He shrugged me off with violent force, nearly knocking me backward. The strength behind his movement was surprising. Andrew had lost weight and muscle mass during his months of depression, but he threw me off like I weighed nothing. "Don't interrupt," he snapped, never taking his eyes off the mirror. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" The whispers were becoming overwhelming now, dozens of voices speaking at the same time in that strange chorus. They seemed to be responding to Andrew's words, growing more excited or angry with each repetition. The temperature had dropped so far that I could see my breath clearly with every exhale, white clouds forming and disappearing in the candlelight. I looked toward the hallway mirror, trying to see what had captured Andrew's attention so completely. The reflection should have shown the living room from the mirror's perspective, the chalk circle, the candles, Andrew and me standing near it. Instead, the glass seemed darker than it should have been, like someone had turned down the lights in the reflection while leaving the actual room unchanged. Something was moving behind the mirror's surface, not a reflection of movement in the room, but independent motion that seemed to be happening inside the glass itself. Dark shapes moved and flowed like shadows underwater, and sometimes I thought I could make out more defined shapes moving through the darkness. Andrew's voice reached a high point as he repeated the words one final time, putting all his remaining strength and hope into them. "Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, Mr. Gosmix, can you bring my daughter back?" The whispers stopped instantly, cutting off mid-syllable to leave the house in complete silence. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise had been, like someone had thrown a switch and eliminated every sound in the world. I couldn't hear traffic outside, or the house settling, or even the faint buzz of electronics that usually formed the background noise of modern life. Andrew stood motionless inside the chalk circle, staring at the mirror with desperate anticipation. The silence stretched between us. Andrew stayed frozen inside the chalk circle, his eyes locked on the hallway mirror. Sweat kept running down his face even though the temperature had dropped so much that my breath formed white clouds in the candlelight. Then the mirror's surface moved, not a reflection changing or shadows moving behind the glass. The actual surface rippled outward from the center like someone had dropped a stone into still water. The glass itself became fluid, waves spreading in perfect circles that shouldn't have been possible. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things, but the ripples kept spreading until the entire mirror surface looked like a vertical pond disturbed by some unseen impact. Andrew made a small sound in his throat, part gasp, part whimper, but he didn't move from his position inside the circle. The ripples began to settle and something started taking shape behind the glass. At first, just a dark outline that could have been anything. A person, a tall piece of furniture, a shadow. But the outline grew more clear with each passing second, developing edges and angles that turned into a distinctly human silhouette. The figure stepped forward through the mirror's surface like walking through liquid mercury. Water should have splashed or dripped, but the glass simply parted around the emerging shape and reformed seamlessly behind it. A man in an expensive gray suit appeared completely into the hallway, his polished shoes clicking against Andrew's hardwood floor. He was tall, taller than seemed normal for the narrow hallway space, and his proportions felt wrong in ways that made my eyes want to look away. His arms hung too long at his sides, fingers extending past where they should have ended. His legs appeared stretched, like someone had pulled him on a medieval rack until his bones lengthened beyond human limits. But it was his smile that made my stomach clench. Too wide for his face, showing too many teeth that seemed too sharp. "Andrew Mitchell," the figure said, and his voice arrived inside my head rather than through my ears. The words formed clearly in my thoughts while his lips barely moved, creating an unsettling disconnect between what I saw and what I heard. "Congratulations on performing the summoning correctly. Very few manage such precision on their first attempt." Andrew's knees buckled slightly, but he managed to remain standing inside the chalk circle. His voice came out as a croak when he tried to respond. "Are you Mr. Gosmix?" "I am, indeed." The figure's smile stretched wider, if that was possible. "And you are exactly as desperate as I was told you would be. Perfect." Something about his casual tone made the room feel colder than it already was. This wasn't the dramatic, otherworldly presence I might have expected from a supernatural entity. Mr. Gosmix spoke like a businessman reviewing a contract, with polite professionalism that somehow made everything more disturbing. "My daughter," Andrew managed. "Emily. Can you bring her back?" Mr. Gosmix tilted his head, studying Andrew with eyes that reflected the candlelight in a weird way. When he moved, his arms and legs bent at angles that suggested his joints worked differently than human bones should allow. "Ah yes, little Emily Mitchell, 8 years old, brown hair, green eyes, fond of mismatched socks and chalk drawings." He paused, letting those specific details sink in. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you, Andrew." The way he drew out Andrew's name made it sound like he was savoring the syllables. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, every instinct screaming that I needed to get Andrew away from this thing immediately. "Emily is indeed dead," Mr. Gosmix continued with the same casual tone he might use to discuss weather conditions. "Her body was discovered yesterday morning in a wooded area outside Bakersfield, California, 3 states away from where she disappeared. The individual responsible for her death showed considerable creativity in his methods, though I suspect the details would prove too disturbing for parental consumption." Andrew made a sound like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He dropped to his knees inside the chalk circle, his whole body folding in on itself as sobs began tearing from his throat. The notebook fell from his hands and hit the floor with a soft thump. "No," Andrew whispered between gasps. "No, no, no. She's not dead. She can't be dead. You're supposed to bring her back." Mr. Gosmix watched Andrew's breakdown with clear interest, like he was watching a really interesting scientific experiment. He didn't offer comfort or show any sign of sympathy for the grief he'd just caused. "However," Mr. Gosmix said, raising his voice slightly to carry over Andrew's sobbing, "death need not be permanent. I specialize in correcting such unfortunate circumstances, provided the price is acceptable to all parties involved." Andrew looked up through his tears, hope and worry fighting on his face. "What price? Tell me what you want. Anything. I'll give you anything. The exchange is quite simple, really. A life for a life. Your death in place of hers." Mr. Gosmix spoke like he was describing a basic transaction at a grocery store. "You take Emily's place in the ground and she returns to life with no memory of her suffering. No trauma, no pain, no knowledge of what was done to her. She simply comes home." The words hit me like physical blows. I stepped toward the chalk circle, wanting to grab Andrew and drag him away from this creature before he could agree to anything so insane. "Andrew, don't listen to him," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd expected. "This isn't real. This is some kind of psychological manipulation. Emily's not dead. She's missing, but she's not dead." Mr. Gosmix turned his attention to me for the first time, and his smile became predatory. When those unnatural eyes focused on my face, I felt like I was being cataloged, studied, evaluated for potential usefulness. "James Patterson," he said, and my name sounded wrong coming from his mouth. 30 years old, military background, loyal friend, voice of reason. You've spent considerable time and energy trying to keep Andrew tethered to reality during his months of grief and desperation. I hadn't told him my name. Andrew hadn't mentioned my name during the summoning, but Mr. Gosmix spoke like he'd been expecting me, like my presence had been part of his calculations all along. "Unfortunately," Mr. Gosmix continued, "reality has proven rather unpleasant for your friend. Emily Mitchell was tortured for 6 days before her death. Her killer documented his work extensively. The police will release those details to the family within the week, once positive identification is confirmed through dental records." Andrew's sobbing got worse, his whole body shaking with grief. Seeing him fall apart like that made me want to put my fist through Mr. Gosmix's skull, supernatural entity or not. "This is what I hoped for," Andrew whispered, looking up at me through streaming tears. "All along, James, this is what I prayed for. A chance to trade places with her, to give her back her life." The honesty in his voice stopped my arguments cold. 3 months of watching Andrew destroy himself with guilt and grief suddenly made horrible sense. He hadn't been hoping to find Emily alive. He'd been hoping to find a way to die in her place. "Andrew, please," I said, but the words felt inadequate against the weight of his pain. "There has to be another way. We can figure something else out." "What other way?" Andrew's voice broke on the question. "She's dead, James. Tortured and murdered by some sick freak while I was buying coffee 30 yards away. What other way could possibly matter now?" Mr. Gosmix watched our exchange with obvious satisfaction, like he was enjoying the emotional trouble he'd created. He stepped closer to the mirror's surface, his tall body moving smoothly in a way that made my skin crawl. "The offer stands," Mr. Gosmix said. "Your life for hers. Your death for her resurrection. Your eternal suffering for her chance at a full, normal childhood. The exchange must be made willingly, and it cannot be reversed once completed." Andrew wiped his face with the back of his hand and struggled to his feet inside the chalk circle. His decision was already made. I could see it in the way he straightened his shoulders and squared his jaw. The same expression he'd worn when he'd decided to perform this ritual in the first place. "I accept," Andrew said firmly. "I accept the trade." Mr. Gosmix's smile stretched impossibly wide, showing rows of teeth that were definitely not human. He extended one arm toward the mirror, and his limb passed through the glass surface like it was made of water instead of solid matter. His hand emerged into the living room, fingers that were too long and joints that bent wrong reaching toward Andrew inside the chalk circle. "Take my hand, Andrew Mitchell, and complete the exchange." I lunged forward before Andrew could move, grabbing for his arm to pull him back from whatever Mr. Gosmix was offering. But something invisible hit me hard, throwing me backward across the room. I crashed into the couch and rolled onto the floor, my head spinning from the impact. Andrew reached out and took Mr. Gosmix's extended hand. The moment their skin made contact, Andrew's body began shaking violently. His back arched and his limbs jerked like he was being shocked, but no sound came from his mouth at first. Then the screaming started. I'd never heard anything like the sounds Andrew made as Mr. Gosmix began pulling him toward the mirror. They weren't human screams. They carried a quality of pure pain that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat or lungs. The sounds filled the house and seemed to bounce around inside my bones, making my teeth ache. Andrew's body stretched and twisted as he was dragged toward the mirror's surface. His free arm moved wildly, trying to grab onto something solid, but there was nothing within reach except empty air. His legs kicked frantically as whatever force was pulling him grew stronger. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the chalk circle, but the invisible barrier hit me again, this time hard enough to knock me flat on my back. I could only watch helplessly as Andrew was pulled closer and closer to the mirror. His body began passing through the glass surface, starting with his extended arm and shoulder. The mirror accepted him like he was made of liquid, offering no resistance as he was drawn through what should have been solid glass. His torso disappeared next, then his legs, his whole body twisting and bending in ways that should have been impossible. Andrew's screams cut off suddenly as his head passed through the mirror. One moment he was there, thrashing and fighting against the force pulling him through the glass. The next moment he was gone completely, leaving only the empty chalk circle and the sudden complete silence that filled the house. Mr. Gosmix stepped back through the mirror, releasing Andrew's hand as both of them disappeared into whatever existed behind the glass surface. The mirror's surface rippled once more, then returned to normal, reflecting only the empty hallway and the burning candles in the living room. I lay on the floor, staring at the ordinary-looking mirror that had just swallowed my best friend whole. The house felt impossibly quiet after Andrew's screams, like all sound had been drained out of the world along with his life. The black notebook lay open where Andrew had dropped it, its pages moving slightly in air currents I couldn't feel. The chalk circle remained intact on the hardwood floor, white lines forming a perfect boundary around empty space where Andrew had stood just moments before. He was gone. Completely, utterly gone. And somewhere, somehow, Emily was coming back. The 4 black candles went out at the same time, like someone had blown them all at once. The house went completely dark, leaving me turned around and struggling to remember where everything was. I could smell the sharp smoke from the blown-out wicks, but even that normal smell felt wrong after everything that had just happened. My hands shook as I pushed myself up from the hardwood floor, using the couch arm for support. The darkness was total. No streetlight coming through the covered windows. No digital clocks glowing from electronics Andrew had unplugged hours earlier. I moved toward where I remembered the light switch being, my feet unsteady and my sense of direction completely mixed up. My palm hit the wall switch on the 3rd try, and the overhead light flooded the living room with harsh brightness that made me squint and blink. The sudden light showed exactly what I'd feared to see. Nothing. Andrew was gone. The chalk circle stayed perfect and unbroken on the hardwood floor, white lines making a clear boundary around empty space. The 4 black candles sat in their spots, their wicks still smoking slightly from being recently blown out. I turned toward the hallway mirror, but it looked completely normal now. Just glass showing the living room behind me, my own confused face, and the evidence of the ritual Andrew had done. No dark shapes moving behind the surface, no rippling glass, no signs that it had ever been anything other than an ordinary mirror on an ordinary wall. The black notebook lay open where Andrew had dropped it, pages spread wide to show the careful handwriting that had started this entire nightmare. Everything else, the whispers, the cold air, the presence that had called itself Mr. Gosmix, had disappeared as completely as Andrew himself. I stood in the middle of his living room processing what I'd seen. Andrew was dead. He'd made a deal with something that shouldn't exist, traded his life for Emily's, and been dragged through a mirror into whatever place existed on the other side. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this was impossible, that mirrors don't work like doorways and dead children don't come back to life. But I'd seen it happen. I'd heard Andrew's screams as he was pulled through solid glass. The front door opened slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence that had settled over the house. Emily Mitchell walked in. She looked exactly as she had 3 months ago, before her disappearance. Healthy, alert, completely unharmed. Her long brown hair was clean and brushed, falling in gentle waves around her shoulders. She wore a yellow dress with sunflower buttons, the same dress Andrew had described her wearing on the day she disappeared. Her green eyes were bright and curious as she looked around the living room, taking in the covered mirrors and the chalk circle on the floor with obvious confusion. "Why are you in my house?" she asked, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact directness that 8-year-olds used when adults did things that didn't make sense. "And where's my dad?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Emily was standing right there, solid and real and breathing, asking about her father who had just been pulled through a mirror by a creature with too many teeth. The disconnect between what I'd seen and what I was seeing now made my head spin. Emily turned her head, waiting for an answer that I couldn't give. She looked perfectly normal. No signs of trauma or fear or the horrible experiences Mr. Gosmix had described so casually. Her skin was unmarked, her clothes were clean, and she moved with the easy confidence of a child who felt safe in her own home. Your dad asked me to come over," I managed finally, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "He had to go somewhere. But you're supposed to be..." I caught myself before saying dead or missing or any of the other words that would shatter whatever miracle had brought her back. Emily was here, alive, looking at me like I was the strange element in this situation rather than her impossible return from the grave. "I got lost," Emily said like she was explaining something obvious. "But a nice man helped me find my way home. He said my dad was waiting for me." The simple way she explained it made my stomach tighten. No memory of disappearing from a playground, no awareness of the 3 months that had passed, no knowledge of what Mr. Gosmix had told us about her death and torture. Emily remembered being lost and someone helping her get home, and that was apparently all she experienced. "Do you remember anything else?" I asked carefully, crouching down to her eye level. "About where you were, or how long you were gone?" Emily shrugged, the move showing the casual dismissal that children used when adults asked about things that didn't interest them. "Not really. It's all kind of fuzzy. But I'm home now, so it doesn't matter." I looked at her face, searching for any sign of the trauma that should have been there. 3 months of being missing, and according to Mr. Gosmix, 6 days of torture before being murdered. But Emily's expression held nothing but mild confusion about finding me in her living room and curiosity about where her father had gone. Andrew had given her more than just life. He'd given her a clean slate, free from whatever horrors she'd experienced. Emily had no memory of her disappearance, no knowledge of her death, no awareness that her father had traded his existence for hers. She was exactly as she'd been before that morning at the playground, as if the last 3 months had never happened. "I'm tired," Emily announced, covering a small yawn with her hand. "I think I'm going to go to my room and rest for a while." She went toward the stairs without waiting for my response, moving through the house with the easy movement of someone who belonged there. I watched her climb the steps, her small hand trailing along the banister, yellow dress swishing around her legs. She looked like any normal 8-year-old heading to her bedroom after a long day. When I heard her door close upstairs, I finally let myself move. The black notebook still lay open on the hardwood floor, its pages containing instructions that had worked exactly as promised. Andrew had followed every step precisely, and the exchange had been completed. His life for Emily's, his death for her resurrection, his eternal suffering for her chance at a normal childhood. I couldn't let anyone else find that notebook. Police would come eventually, when Andrew was reported missing. They'd search the house, ask questions about where he'd gone, and why his 8-year-old daughter was suddenly home after 3 months. The notebook contained information that no one else should ever see, instructions that desperate people might try to follow. I picked up the notebook and closed it carefully. The material still had that unnatural polish, that perfect smoothness that had made it feel wrong from the first moment I touched it. But now it just seemed like an expensive journal, nothing more sinister than high-quality leather bound around pages of careful handwriting. The chalk circle could stay. Police might find it strange, but they'd assume it was part of some harmless ritual or hobby. The covered mirrors would seem eccentric, but not criminal. Emily's return would be miraculous, but not impossible. Children went missing and came home all the time, even after months of searching. But the notebook was different. The notebook contained actual instructions for contacting entities that could grant wishes in exchange for terrible prices. I carried it through the kitchen to the back door, stepping out into Andrew's small backyard. The grass needed cutting, and Emily's old swing set sat unused in the corner, chains hanging empty in the pre-dawn air. Andrew had always kept a metal fire barrel near the back fence for burning yard waste, and I dragged it to the center of the yard where the neighbors wouldn't see smoke rising. I opened the notebook to the first page and tore it out carefully. The paper felt heavier than normal, with a texture that reminded me of parchment or expensive stationery. I crumpled it into a loose ball and dropped it into the fire barrel, then used the matches Andrew had left on his patio table to light the paper.
The flame caught immediately, burning brighter and hotter than normal paper should have. I tore out the next page and fed it to the fire, watching Andrew's chance at supernatural hope turn to ash one sheet at a time. Each page burned completely, leaving no partially charred edges or readable fragments behind. The handwriting disappeared into flames that seemed to burn with unusual intensity. Instructions for contacting Mr. Gosmix, descriptions of the exchange system, warnings about proper ritual preparation, all of it reduced to smoke and ash that rose into the morning air. I fed page after page to the fire until only the leather cover remained in my hands. The cover burned differently than the pages, producing thick black smoke that made my eyes water. But it burned completely, leaving nothing recognizable behind. When the last of the leather had been consumed, I stirred the ashes with a stick to make sure no words or symbols remained visible. The flames died down to nothing, leaving only normal ash that looked like any other burned paper. A breeze picked up and scattered the remains across Andrew's backyard, gray flakes disappearing into the grass and flower beds where Emily used to play during better times. I returned to my base that afternoon, driving the same route I'd taken the night before, when Andrew had called with desperate hope in his voice. The highway looked different in daylight, normal and mundane, filled with regular people going about their regular lives. I passed the exit that led to Andrew's neighborhood, where Emily was probably waking up from her nap and wondering when her father would come home. What I'd seen sat heavy in my chest as I pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment building. Andrew's sacrifice, Emily's second chance, the knowledge that supernatural forces existed and could be contacted by desperate people with enough determination. I would never speak of what really happened that night. Emily would grow up believing her father had simply disappeared, another tragedy in a world already full of them. She would never know that he'd loved her enough to trade his existence for hers,
or that she'd been given a gift that came at the ultimate price. But I would know. I would carry the memory of Andrew's screams as he was pulled through that mirror, and the sight of Emily walking through the front door like she'd never been gone at all. That knowledge would stay with me for the rest of my life. A secret too dangerous to share and too important to forget.